What if I told you that this scene, which is the foundation for the entire lore of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, got the timeline, location, and characters wrong from the original lore written by J.R.R. Tolkien? Well, that's what we're going to explore in today's video, but before we get started, here's a brief backstory on how all of this began. Peter Jackson and his team are known for creating one of the most legendary film trilogies in history, and this is especially impressive considering that they are adaptations from Tolkien's original work in the 1950s. However, the Lord of the Rings film franchise wasn't able to get everything right, and the lore of Middle-earth is just so extensive that it would be impossible to fit inside of one trilogy. Although Jackson did an amazing job, there are so many things about the movies that differ from Tolkien's actual writings. Whether it's characters that are completely left out, shifts in the timeline, or a total change of the original plot, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens had to alter some things to adapt the books for the silver screen. Which made me wonder, what if I went through scene by scene and found all the differences between the books and the movies? Well, there's no what if about it now because this is episode 1 of who knows how many, in a series I'm calling Movies vs. Manuscripts, where we will compare the original works in the lore of Tolkien's Middle-earth to the adaptation, and point out what is fact and what is fantasy. Whether you're a fan of Tolkien or have never even read the books, this is a series that will be great to help you learn more about the vast lore of Middle-earth, so without further ado, let's pick up from the first scene in the Fellowship of the Ring, extended edition obviously, the prologue.
One ring to rule them all.
The Lord of the Rings trilogy opens with an amazing setup for the rest of the films, that fills the viewer in on the lore of the fantasy world that they're about to explore and introduces the main antagonist as well as the One Ring itself. The 7.5-minute introduction gives the viewer the foundation they need to understand what forces are at play in the universe of Middle-earth. But there are actually 9 main discrepancies between what Tolkien wrote about these events and what is portrayed in the movies. For this series, we'll be breaking things down into 4 categories and ranking the differences on a 5-ring grading system. The categories are characters, plot and themes, locations, and timeline. Since this is the first episode, more categories might be added in the future, and as always, feel free to comment if you notice anything that I might have missed. The grading system will range from superior to sacrilege, depending on how good or bad I feel the change is, and keep in mind that the grading system is definitely subjective, so if you disagree with me, that's okay. So let's dive into the first category of characters. In the prologue scene of the movies, we are introduced, whether we know it or not, to 7 characters of Middle-earth. Sauron, our main antagonist, Elrond, the leader of the elves and owner of one of the 3 rings of the elves, Elendil, the High King of Men, Isildur, his son, Bilbo the Hobbit, Gollum, who is presumably a type of hobbit before finding the ring and then devolving into the mess that we know him as, and then lastly, Galadriel, who does the voiceover and is another owner of one of the 3 elven rings. And speaking of the rings, we'll address that plot difference in just a minute. But as far as character differences, there are actually a few more characters that Tolkien includes in this particular event that are not mentioned in the movies. These characters are Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves and the original owner of the ring Vilya before giving it to Elrond, 3 of Isildur's 4 sons, Elendur, Eraton, and Carion, and Anarion, Isildur's brother. But how do all these extra characters play a role in the lore? Well, to answer that, we must head into the next category of plot and thematic differences. Before we head into the battle portion of the lore, let me quickly address the plot point that happens at the very beginning of the prologue. In Galadriel's narration, she says that Sauron gifted rings to different races of Middle-earth. However, Sauron did not make the 3 rings for the elves. In fact, he only made 16 rings of power for men and dwarves alongside Celebrimbor, a master smith of the elves. Later, Celebrimbor made 3 elven rings using the knowledge that he got from Sauron, but Sauron himself did not make them. If you want a more in-depth video on who Celebrimbor was, I linked a great video in the description because for this series, we won't have time to dive into the biographies of every single character. Okay, now moving back to the battle and how our missing characters tie in, you see, technically the prologue describes this battle as happening fairly quickly, and on the slopes of Mount Doom. However, this battle actually refers to a 7-year siege that the last alliance of men and elves made on Barad-dûr, which is the Dark Tower of Sauron and Mordor. It also ticks the box for only location and timeline differences in this episode. The siege lasted from Second Age 3434 until 3441, and this is where some of our missing characters play a role. For example, in the 6th year of the siege, Anarion, Isildur's brother, died by essentially getting hit on the head by a rock, and then a year later is when the event shown in the movie happens and we see our other missing characters. Elendil is shown briefly in the fight as Sauron kills him, but what isn't shown is quite a big plot difference. According to the Silmarillion and other sources written by Tolkien, Elendil and Gil-galad actually had a massive fight with Sauron during the battle, and end up mortally wounding him. In the process, they both die, and as Elendil fell, he falls on his own sword, Narsil, breaking it. Sauron does not step on it like in the movie, and by the time Isildur gets to him after his father dies, Sauron's physical form is already dying, and Isildur simply cuts off his fingers and takes the One Ring, which officially causes Sauron to be defeated. One might think that these are minor differences, but they actually play a role in showing the importance of Aragorn. You see, Aragorn is the last remaining person in his bloodline, and Anarion's death helps solidify this fact, as he could have carried on the bloodline himself if he had lived. And remember how I mentioned 3 of Isildur's sons? Well, post-battle, the prologue scene shows Isildur getting ambushed, which in Tolkien's lore is known as the Disaster of the Gladden Fields. This event happens as Isildur is heading home with his 3 sons after the siege has finished. The sons are not shown in the prologue scene, but all 3 of them die along with their father, leaving Isildur's youngest son, Valindiel, left to his bloodline. Valindiel goes on to be High King of Arnor for over 200 years and is the great times like a million grandpa to Aragorn. And a small aside, Arnor and Numenor are rarely mentioned in the films, although they do play a massive role in the history of Middle-earth. So now that we've covered the siege and the disaster of the Gladden Fields, let's address the final part of the prologue, which shows Bilbo taking the ring. Obviously, a small detail is missing, which is the riddle game that we end up seeing in the Hobbit trilogy. In this prologue, we really have absolutely no idea how a hobbit ended up in a random cave far beneath a mountain. But if you've read the books or watched the newer Hobbit trilogy from Peter Jackson, you know that Bilbo makes his way there during his journey with Thorin's company to reclaim the Lonely Mountain, which is also where Bilbo seems to gain his massive wealth and much of his obstinate personality, separating him from other hobbits. But we can address more of that in future episodes.
No, thank you!
In reality, most of this information is found in sources other than the Fellowship of the Ring book, but in order to set a foundation, Peter Jackson and his writers pulled information from sources like the Lord of the Rings appendices and the Silmarillion to round out a good intro for the films. So I understand that as a first episode of this YouTube series, we aren't really comparing the prologue scene with the Fellowship of the Ring book, but rather all of Tolkien's available writings regarding the lore of Middle-earth. So now that we have officially listed out all the differences between the first scene of the Lord of the Rings films and Tolkien's actual lore, let's quickly go through and rank what worked and what didn't. First, as far as the character category goes, I give the changes Jackson and company made a 4 out of 5. The characters left out are not insignificant in the overall lore of Middle-earth, but for a viewer watching the films, you don't really need to know about them to grasp what is happening. In regards to the plot and thematic elements, I rank the scene another 4 out of 5. This is mainly because of Gil-galad and Elendil. I think it would have been really cool to see them fight Sauron, but I understand it probably would have added another 5 to 10 minutes to the film. Second to last, we have location, which is a 5 out of 5 for me. Given the character changes and how condensed they had to make the lore for the 7-minute opening scene, having the battle on the slopes of Mount Doom itself is a lot more epic. And lastly, regarding the timeline, it's a 5 out of 5 again, because let's be real, a 7-year siege could have been a whole trilogy on its own, so obviously they had to shrink it to just one battle for the film. And that concludes the differences between Tolkien's lore and the first scene of Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a like, and comment your rankings down below on what you would have wished to see in this scene. And if there's anything I missed or if I made any errors, which will be inevitable in a massive series like this, please comment below so I can make corrections in the following video. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll see you in the next episode.